I'm Mary Hulst. I serve here at Calvin as the university pastor. I'm going to demonstrate what each of our panelists is going to do next, which is to say I've been here for 14 years. My context of the people who listen to me preach are 18 to 22-year-olds, predominantly white, predominantly Christian, widely ecumenical, and a growing international and BIPOC student group. I preach usually every Wednesday in our chapel and really love it. So that's who I am. Laura, tell the people who you are.
I'm Laura DeYoung. I am the pastor of preaching and pastoral care at Community Christian Reformed Church in Kitchener, Ontario, just about an hour from Toronto. I've been there a year, and so I'm still very much kind of figuring out my people. Do you want us to get into
We just do the basics
the
now.
basics,
We'll
the basics
and I'll bring
now,
it back.
and then okay.
I'll bring it back.
But yeah, large, to me, 500 or so member congregation, 2 other pastors, and
Great.
yeah.
Thank you. Marsh.
Hello, thank you, Mayor. Marshall Hatch, Senior Pastor of the New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago. That's a long name, but it's obviously overwhelmingly, predominantly African-American congregation in the city on the west side of Chicago. I've been there. This is my 30th year, and then I had right.
Yeah, yes.
Well, then I might as well add, this is my second church. I was at our first church for 8 years, so this is my 38th year pastoring. And it's been an incredible place to impact for the kingdom of God. We have been there doing community development as well. And I also teach at Northern Seminary, preaching and pastoral ethics and race and poverty and justice and reconciliation. Those are courses I predominantly teach.
So the light, frothy topic.
The light topics.
Yeah.
It's simple.
Simple. Everyone agrees.
Danny Román-Gloró. I am currently the director of the Asbury Latino Center for Asbury Theological Seminary, and get to live in Orlando, Florida, instead of Wilmore, Kentucky, which is where Asbury is. Before that, I did pastor for 23 years, but now I primarily preach by invitation, which happens probably 3 Sundays of the month, and end up preaching in 50-member churches to 3,000-member churches, and just running the gamut of the people I encounter on Sundays when I preach. But the one thing they have in common is that I meet them for the first time that Sunday.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Great. Very good. Just to let you know, toward the end of our conversation, we'll have times for you to step forward and offer questions. So as we're chatting, feel free to write something down and so you don't forget it and we can go on it later. So we're going to talk about our preaching contexts. What's the makeup of the worshiping body, their educational level, their comfort with engagement during the preaching act. This is what we're going to talk about in the context that we know. And it could be, for you, it could be where you were pastoring compared to where you are now. And 30 years, what have you seen? What do you know a year in? So in my context, I have a wide diversity of biblical and theological literacy, from students who've been baptized in the church, Sunday school, Christian day school, they know the Bible, they know theology, to students who became a Christian just a year or 2 ago, maybe the only Christian in their family. The Bible is brand new to them. And so my preaching context, I have to say things like, today we're reading from the book of Lamentations, which was literally today's sermon. And the book of Lamentations is, and I give a bit of history and explain it. And this is where we find it in the Bible, and hold your finger there. So I can't assume a great deal about my listening audience. I will say that they laugh a lot, which is a great thing as preachers, to have a congregation that laughs at the right times, appropriately.
Yeah, definitely.
Appropriate amounts of time. So they're very engaging. They ask good questions. They listen well. So I'm really grateful for them.
Well, now I think we're at about 350 a week, the people that actually come to the building. Of course, since the pandemic, we're streaming live, and a lot of people are opting to do that as time has gone along. And although people are, regathering, I think, pretty nicely. My congregation is probably predominantly African American working class, but it is a kind of ministry in inner city that also, attracts people who have moved out of the neighborhood or who have family members, so it can go from professional, literally PhD to GED, and so it's just kind of that diversity of people in the African American community. And we also have a pretty interesting sort of outreach ministry in our community. Young man, my son runs a project called Maafa, Redemption Project, M-A-A-F-A, Kiswahili word that means the great calamity. It just talks about the effects that we deal with of the racial history in America. But these young men, some of them are residential, and some of the buildings that the church owns around there, and wraparound services. And so it's an interesting context. We have a worship service on Sunday, and all during the week there's this almost what I call first century Christianity, where we're literally, having discipling men who've come literally off the corners in the neighborhood.
So I mentioned a little bit about the fact that I probably preach at a different place. There's places that call me back, like, that's nice. Right? You're like, oh, you liked it. And so, but because of my work, it's primarily in the Hispanic Latino community. So I spend a great deal of time working with these pastors and getting them to school and getting them through school. And so, like I said, I find sometimes churches that are 3,000 members, and those are very diverse in economics, very diverse in social matrices and what have you. And then sometimes, last Sunday, I was in Nashville, Tennessee, and I did a workshop on Saturday, and the pastor said to me, that was great. Do you mind preaching tomorrow morning? And I said, okay, sure, I'll preach. And so I went back to the hotel and figured out what I was going to say. And that was a Pentecostal community. So one of the things I find myself in, one of the challenges I find myself with, is that I have to be Pentecostal to the Pentecostals in kind of mainline denominational to the mainline denomination. What does that mean? Well, it means that there's a lot of, so last Sunday I preached moving through the altar, just on the side, come back and went back to the other side, and got people excited, and got people what have you. And then there's other times that I'm behind the lectern, just kind of subdued and quiet, and so it varies. It really do. It really does vary for me, the people that I'm encountering. But again, I think commonality is sometimes I speak in English, sometimes I speak in Spanish, sometimes I end up having translation, and I prefer to do my own translate myself instead of having a translator. I get a better rhythm that way. And so, and don't mind me, I don't speak English or Spanish, so it's just what I'm trying here. I'm working on that. But it depends. So it really varies. But anyway.
Yeah, my congregation is, there's about 500 members, and probably 350 are coming regularly at this point, maybe 400. And so one of the interesting things I've found is, to me, that's a very large congregation to be preaching to. They are all deeply anxious about where all of their people are. And I'm just like, this is great. Look at all the kids you have on Sunday morning. There's so many of them, right? So that's been an interesting experience. It's a predominantly white congregation. There's a smattering of refugee families, and we're an hour from Toronto, and the suburbs are just like, we used to be very rural, cornfields everywhere, and now the suburbs are growing up around us, and so some people are moving, commuters from Toronto that are now living around us, and those tend to come from different ethnic backgrounds. It's probably, predominantly middle class, lots of technology folk, and trades, I would say, is the biggest group of people. Yeah.
What's the level of biblical knowledge? I was thinking, for those of you who were here for the service, that in Pastor Karen's prayer, she had so many biblical references. Beautiful prayer. But I was thinking about how most people would not get all those beautiful references. So when you're preaching, what's the level of biblical literacy you can assume? Now, yours is a little bit different. It's different every time. But for your congregations, what are you learning about? What do you see different over 30 years? What do you see a year in? Anybody can answer.
Yeah, I've seen incredible, I think, changes in terms of people's discipline to be taught over long periods of time on, say, like a book or a doctrine, so that there's been some decline, I would say, in what I would expect, for people to be. I was just sharing some of the seminarians. I could, years ago, take a year and a half and teach verse by verse through Revelation on a Wednesday night. And people would come Wednesday after Wednesday. I would say sometime before the pandemic, it became clear, I could teach on Sabbath, I could teach on, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, ordering your life around the rhythm of the Sabbath. I mean, I've done devotionals where I've done a 40-day devotional writing on the Sabbath as the rhythm of spiritual life. And then it became clear to me, no matter how much teaching, some of these people, they ain't coming every Sunday. They're just not going to do it. And then, of course, the pandemic has exacerbated that, and now we're hybrid, so they might be there physically some Sundays and then not other Sundays. So I've seen that sort of impact my ability to kind of do a sustained kind of thing, although, I've found other creative ways to do it. Again, writing my own devotionals, 40 days during the holy season, 21 days in the fall, and normally teach around those themes that I've written about, and we're reading daily, and we're having a prayer online daily, and the readings. So, I found that as a reinforcing either themes or something that we're trying to deposit in the congregation, being very effective doing that. Nothing have I found to be more effective than traditional Sunday school, which is part of what we're trying to get back. Because in the pandemic, I found out, incredible amount of folks that I had that could teach, with or without a title. I mean, that could, and if I boil it all down, these were people who came to Sunday school. We had this international Sunday school series that changed testaments every 3 months, and every 7 years you've studied the whole Bible, so that people that spent a decade or more, I mean, really grew through that curriculum. And so that has been very effective. But I do think that we're very challenged now because the pandemic has changed to some great extent people's habits of being a regular Sabbath keeper, regular churchgoer. And so that brings about challenges when it comes to really teaching didactically and really growing people through just a consistency of their availability and consistency of your preparation.
I think my people are really hungry for that. That's what I've observed over the last year. Particularly, I would say people 55 and older. And they'll come to me. They really love the sermons where we like give them Greek and Hebrew words, right? Which I love because I love giving Greek and Hebrew words. But they seem to, or when we preach through a Bible, a book, and they're always clamoring for more Bible studies and to really just dig into what is here. So it's interesting to me, right? That there's, and that kind of makes sense generationally to me as well. My context, I think most people grew up in the church. Most of them went to Christian school. A handful of them would have gone to a Christian university or college. For many in this congregation, they probably have not missed too many Sundays, right? But yeah, that's been just one of these things that I've observed this year, is that there does seem to be this hunger for in-depth biblical study.
It's interesting you mentioned Sunday school, because one of the things I've seen in common as I've traveled is that there is no Sunday school. I mean, that's what I've seen, is that more and more churches are dropping the idea of Sunday school. Maybe having midweek groups, small groups or something to that effect. But the idea of, which I agree with you, is very helpful, because it gives you context. It gives biblical literacy that allows you then to preach in a different way. And I just have seen less and less. Again, this particular church I was in Nashville had no Sunday school. And I've seen less and less Sunday school. And I think that there is, at least in the Latino church, I think part of the problem has been the urgency of work, the urgency of making money to survive and making money to send back home, that has cut off the idea of, and perhaps made worse by the pandemic, cut off the idea of having Sunday school or even midweek Bible studies.
Yeah. So in your context for each of you, is there anything that you do, you've got a sermon text in mind, you're thinking about Sunday, is there any way you intentionally engage your congregation or the people who may hear you before you preach, like a Bible study on the text, or walking around the office asking for ideas? What's the range of engagement that you have with your people before you preach?
Well, you know, I'm gonna tell you something. I really enjoy it. It can be a lot of work for me at parts of the year, but I write the 40-day devotional for the Lent season, and then I preach and teach lessons through that. So thematically, it could be stewardship, it could be discipleship, it could be vision, it could be, the church. What is the church? I did one on church attendance in the fall. And so I do 21 days, October 1st to 21st, and then the 40 days in the holy season. And those are the themes that I'm going to preach and teach, including the topics. And then, mostly us older people are on Facebook now, but I'll put it out there during the week. This is what's, this is what the subject is going to be. But I have found it to be very effective for, the repetition of a theme, either through the Bible or book of the Bible, twice a year. That's going to basically provide the material that I'll be preaching and teaching for those 6 weeks and then those 3 weeks. because I don't find that, like a one knockoff sermon is going to be that effective. I mean, it could be a great sermon. Yeah, I think I did good Sunday. My son said I did. But for growth, it has to be something that is thematic. And you can, with the direction of the Holy Spirit, what does this congregation need? And I did think that people need, and the attendance did pick up just the attendance, but their seriousness of this is serious, that we need church. Church doesn't really need us. And I didn't want to buy into this whole consumer and market-driven sort of where, it's as if you're doing us a favor by showing up, And so I really kind of went deep into God is God without us. But we're not who we are without God. That's right. And church is going on, and it was honestly, the giving is up because electronic giving has been spectacular. And the hybrid has added another layer of contact with people that we just did not have before. People that go on vacation actually stay connected while they're away because of the way live streaming works. But to drill in how essential a church is, these relationships are. And this is the kind of world you don't want to be in, disconnected from the body of Christ. I found being able to really teach and preach that with a devotional daily reading that I wrote, because I found out people they like that they actually know the author, me.
Yeah.
And that, the text are given a devotional layout, and then if I'm not teaching, other people are teaching, can teach the themes from it. I've found that to be very, very effective in building congregational life. I mean, actually, the pandemic has been revolutionary in that it sort of transformed us from just weekly meetings to daily meetings. When the pandemic first jumped off in 2020, we were in our 40 days of prayer in that season, and we had a lot of losses. My oldest sister passed April 4th, 2020 from COVID.
I'm sorry.
And but that prayer service was supposed to, daily call-in prayer noon, supposed to be 40 days. It went over 700 days before they took a break. And we went from weekly to daily contact.
Yeah.
And people that were shed in and couldn't get out,
Yeah.
it was a lifeline. And so it's been, it's been a tremendous, I think, opportunity for the church to become much more meaningful than it was pre-pandemic, I think.
Laura or Dana?
Great. One of the interesting things about this church, I was a sole pastor before this, and now I work with 2 other pastors, and so we have weekly meetings. So I don't have a small team of congregants that I bounce ideas off of or glean from, but I am meeting regularly with my co-pastors. And one of the things that does is kind of, we're regularly taking a pulse of the congregation, right? And our sermon series, I plan out a year in advance. So we go on a pastor's retreat. And again, we're taking stock of where the congregation is, right? What's the story, the narrative of the congregation in this moment? What do they need to hear? What would be valuable, right? What would be a good word for them throughout this year? And then, so I've planned worship series. This year is our 75th anniversary. And so starting in July, all of our series were kind of about story, right? What is the story of the church? What is the story of God's faithfulness to his people? What is the story of worship? What is the story in this book? And how do we, out of COVID, right, and in the face of a lot of uncertainty, what is our story now? And how do we tell that story in a changing demographic area? And then every week I'm meeting with the pastors, the other pastors, all three of whom we all preach. And sometimes those questions are, is this still the series we need, right? Is this thing that I planned 6 months ago still going to land in the same way, or has something happened to shift that? More often than not, it's still what we feel like is necessary, right? And sometimes that's a gift, and God is like, no, you like this is here, and you can just go with that. You don't need to reinvent everything. So I think that's been really helpful in this context, right? Of regularly questioning what's going on in the life of the congregation.
Yep.
What we're like some of us know different stories too, right? And so we can kind of ask each other, like, is this gonna push something that we don't wanna push? Is this gonna open a can of worms we need to leave over here? How is this going to land, especially as a new person, right? To have folks who have been there longer, to say, how is this story going to land with people? Has been really helpful.
Yeah. Good.
So I'm going to tap when I was a pastor some years back, and then also an experience through the pandemic. When I was pastoring, one of the things in my last church is that we had a weekly prayer group of mostly women, mostly retired women, who met, and they didn't want me there. Like we have our prayer group. We don't need you. Thank you so much. But yeah, right. Like we know how to pray. We don't need you. Okay. But as time passed, they asked me once to come and talk to them about a particular topic in the Bible that they couldn't get through. So we sat and we talked. And out of that came the idea that I would once a month meet with them and talk about things in the Bible that they found difficult to process and what have you. And it was great because then I found myself learning to think learning to understand what they were thinking when they were listening, because of the questions that they were raising from this text, and also looking at the text from a woman's perspective, which also was good for me. So that's one experience. The other thing that happened during the pandemic was that we started doing a weekly sermon preparation Bible study with pastors. So through Zoom. No, nothing getting together. Don't worry. We weren't in the same room. And that was a joke. Never mind. And so it was great because in that experience, we walked through 2 books of the Bible through 6 months that none of them had preached about before. But I think it was a life-changing experience in that we were working as pastors, talking to each other about this text, studying the Bible together. It was the book of Lamentation and Habakkuk. Talking about disaster and disaster coming and disaster here, and then the whole idea of lamentation and all that goes with that. And so I think that there's something powerful about getting together with, even if it's other pastors and not even people in your church, but other pastors, and talking through the texts and what you see in the text, and kind of checking each other and giving each other wisdom. And one of the things we did purposely is try to avoid making it into a time of just complaining.
Well done. Good.
Yeah, right. That's so easy to do. And so, but we purposely focused on the text and how did the text apply to our community and our situation. And I think it was a great experience. So I don't know that we're going to continue doing it because people now, the pandemic is over and, we're just like ready to go back together. but I think it's powerful, and so maybe we'll do it again.
During the preaching act, how aware are you of what's happening in the congregation? Back when I had a parish, there were a couple of people that I knew I could look at in the midst of my frozen chosen, and they would be my animated ones, right? They'd be the ones like, yes, right. They'd be the nodders, they'd be the smilers, right? So if I had to check like how I was doing, it's like Terry was over here and Harvey was back. I'd like, they're my people. Now I preach in a more dynamic congregation. We also have here at Calvin a group called Ready for Life, which are developmentally delayed students who live in our dorms and take classes. And some of them have no filter. And so if I ask a rhetorical question, they may give the answer. And there are more people who amen, because that's what their culture is. So I've just had to adapt to whatever happens in the space and just kind of roll with it in the moment in a very tight 20-minute window of chapel. So what kinds of things are you paying attention to while you're preaching that may actually impact what you do in the preaching act itself?
We just had dinner with some seminary students who just took their intro to preaching course this past semester. And so they haven't preached in churches before. And so one student is preaching at the end of February for the first time in a church. And he's like, do you have advice for me? Like, what do I do here? And I told him, this is a church where they're interning, so they know at least some folks in the congregation. So I said, if you know of 2 people that you can go up to the Sunday before or before church and tap them and say, I need you to sit there, and I need you to sit there, and I need you to be engaged, right? I need you to nod, I need you to smile, and I need you just to be paying attention and give me this really warm, like, we are in your corner smile. That will be a game changer, because you need, in my former congregation, I had those people, right? That you knew where to look. Because they're frozen chosen.
Yeah.
And I love them dearly, but they're not they're not the most engaging. And what was tricky too was part of that is trust, right?
Yeah.
Also. And I came in as an interim preacher. I was only going to be there for a year. They did not know who I was. They did not know if they should trust me in the pulpit. And so I would crack jokes.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And they're not there with you just because they don't know you.
Right.
Right? And they don't, you haven't really earned that level of connection and relationship. So we, a year in, having extended that interim, I feel like I'm just at the point now where I can make a joke and count on people laughing. Right?
Yep.
Sometimes they still don't. But that's usually because it's not a good joke.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good to own that.
I will own that.
Yeah.
But I think that's been a real a learning thing for me this year is that engagement in preaching takes that level of trust. And you have to kind of get to that point with your congregation.
Yeah.
My context is in the larger context is a subculture. So it can be very animated, and the response can be vocal, bodily. It's when I was growing up in our tradition, my dad was a pastor. It was a drama, and every Sunday was a drama, and the crucifixion, the passion was rehearsed every Sunday in the message as the climax, and the people participated, so that it's probably just unusual in that respect, the kind of response that a person would get. Of course, you have to really be saying something
Yes.
to get the response, you know.
Yes.
But when we went into COVID, and I literally preached to a camera, it's the same as when I'm out of the culture, you know, like
Yeah.
I'm scheduled to be here tomorrow night. I don't expect, like, you know, Sunday morning at the Mount Pilgrim, somebody on the nurses ministry to catch the spirit and go across the front, you know, like I'm accustomed to. So I'm used to going in and out of the subculture. But you know, when we preached to cameras, and there were no folks there, it did, I think, really help sharpen, you know, the preaching in my subculture. That it was, you know, the focus on a different rhythm, because the response of the people sort of contributes to the rhythm of the delivery.
Right.
And you don't get that with a camera, and you don't get that coming out of the subcultural context necessarily. So you rely kind of, I guess, on different feelings. I very rarely prepare a message without always reflecting on the response, or selecting the illustrations to help draw in, to help to make the point, to bring people into whatever the biblical truth is. I'm always thinking of how that's going to be processed, which is almost like the metacognition of humor, right? I mean, you know, I can see people laughing at this while I'm preparing it. This is funny.
Yep.
And the timing of that delivery. I had a lot of fun Sunday. I was preaching about from Philippians, and you know, to know Him and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings and conformity to His death, and it was, you know, do you know Him? And it was an illustration. I knew it was going to be helpful. It wasn't a direct, you know, on the path, but it was just a great one about Bill Withers' song. I knew the young people didn't know it. I said, you need to ask older people. Bill Withers had a song. Who is he? And what is he to you? So I went back and played it to memorize the line where Bill Withers says, I was walking past this guy. He stared me down. I looked at you. You looked at the ground. He said, you cleared your throat. I said, that must be a clue. Now, dagnammit, who is this man and who is he to you? Well, on the west side of Chicago, they went in. You know, it was culturally
Yep. Hit the mark.
connecting.
Yep.
Because people were familiar with the song, and the layers of the songwriting was complex in terms of, you know, dealing with relationship.
Now, in your 30 years, have there been people that you're like, when this person says this, or when I start to hear this, then I know I'm doing well? Or do you have people who are like, oh no, that person just said, help him, Lord, and you're like, oh man.
Yeah.
Do you have people you're like listening for, like, oh good, and then people are like, oh, shish.
One of my delightful moments, I've got this, the group of older women, they're called the Mother's Board. So they're, you know, they're honored women. And they might wear hats or something and sit together. And so they pulled me into a meeting one time early on when I was there. And, well, I was there for a little while. And one of the dear mothers, like a godmother to me, she says, now, Reverend, we mothers know just as clear when you didn't really study
Oh,
You know, and I thought that was beautiful.
yep.
That you know, the relationship was there. That you know, they're my elders, and they're pulling for me, and they know that some they know when you worked on a sermon, and they know when you didn't. You know, so it motivates you.
Yep. That's right.
I think for my experience in the Latino community is I work for my reactions, and I do that by making sure that I use illustrations from people's daily life, and so meaning being very specific, referencing telenovelas that are currently online, you know, like currently being shown, referencing artists or famous celebrities that they know well, so that when I do a joke about that telenovela or that celebrity, you know, it connects, it resonates, and sometimes but I work hard for those. I admit, I craft those and think about those, and if they worked in one place, I make sure to try to work them out again in another place. But it is connecting to what their experiences are and describing those experiences very specifically. Describing those moments when you are on the checkout line and you're looking at El Vocero and looking at the story in El Vocero about somebody, you know, and I just try to be very, very specific so they can see themselves there, and I can see in their faces going, oh yeah, I know what he means. So,
I think one of the interesting things about COVID was that it made me a braver preacher because I wasn't looking at people.
Talk more about that.
And you know, I like to be liked. Right?
that's what you chose to be a pastor.
That's why we chose to be pastors. I like to see people nodding. I like to know that things are landing with them and I haven't offended anyone deeply and everyone is happy at the end of Sunday morning, right? And we've talked quite a bit at this conference already, just in one day, about the climate we're in, where it can be really challenging to preach to people who are, you know, hold this variety of beliefs and opinions about one thing or another. And I know who's going to not love a certain thing.
Yep.
Right? And so sometimes when I'm preaching then to a congregation, it's always in the back of my mind as I'm preaching. What does that person think about that? What does that person think about that? Have I just lost that person for the next 4 weeks? Right? And sometimes that's good, right? Like you want to preach to your people the way that they need to hear things. But it is easy to be scared as a preacher. And there are times where I'm like, no, like this is just what's in the text, right? This is what I think we're called to do, and I need to preach that. And so what happened with COVID in just preaching to my phone for a few weeks, you're not faced with those questions, right? They're kind of there, but they're much more removed. And so I found that just a really interesting, in terms of communal engagement, that not having the communal engagement for a while, I think strengthened my preaching in that way.
Yep.
Made me a little bolder.
Yep. Nice.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that. I remember, you know, having 350 to 400 congregants on a Sunday when there was nobody there, and I would be done preaching, and then I didn't have to talk to anybody. It was great. And it was a real transition when people came back, you know,
Right.
and expected a counseling session right after the sermon, right up front there, you know,
Yeah.
or their time. And it was like, you know, I was reminded how hard I work when, you know, you get through pouring out and then you still, you know, have to give that individual attention right after a service, and how draining, you know, that can be on you physically. But I mean, it was quite a vacation. You preached to camera. I was eating brunch with the wife, like 45 minutes after that at the restaurant. Miss those days.
Talking about the after you preach, people who don't preach, I don't think understand how vulnerable it is, how taxing it is. Mm-hmm. And even if you've done it for 38 years, there's still like, oh, that was a lot. You know, you're only as good as last week's Sunday, right? And so when people come up afterwards and they've got an issue, if they got a thing, they want to talk about that, or if they start critiquing your sermon, like, I didn't get what you talk about that immediate post-service space. Is there anybody you look for? Is there anybody you avoid? You don't have to name names because this is live stream. And what practices do you use to make that not just a space you survive, but a space where you're like, I'm okay, I can do this? Talk about that immediate post-preaching. What's that like? How do you engage the congregation then?
I want to share something that I saw at a church, and then I can speak for myself, from my own experience. But in this particular church that I visited, the pastor was doing a sermon on including disabled people in the congregation, including specifically people with mental health issues, and how the church needed to be open to that, and how the plans that they had as a congregation to do that. And I found it interesting because this was upper middle class, Coral Gables, Florida. If you know anything about Coral Gables, Florida, this is just old money. And what I found interesting that she did after she was done was that she said, as she closed the sermon, she says, and after the service, I am going to be in the fellowship hall for anybody that wants to talk to me about this topic. And so she invited the congregation to have a conversation with her. She says, I will be waiting for you with my cup of coffee in the fellowship hall if you want to talk about this. And I found that interesting. Number one, obviously very vulnerable for her to do that, of course, but found it also powerful because it gave and I don't know, I was unable to stick around to see, you know, if anybody went to talk to her. I wanted to, but I just couldn't. And, but I found it very interesting that she just named it and then said, okay, let's talk about it. And I think that I just thought it was powerful to do that. And so go do it and then call me back, let me know how it went. For me, I'm the guest preacher, so I'm expected to talk to people. Like, people want to talk to me, right? And people want to know more about what I do, and, you know, seminary professor and blah, 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 and, you know, all that kind of stuff. My problem becomes having to talk to people, like tons of people that want to talk to me, not just one or two, but tons of people that want to talk to me.
Whom you don't know.
Whom I have no, you know, like I'm meeting for the first time. Hi, nice to meet you. Okay, oh, nice. Oh, yeah, you're Puerto Rican. Oh, good, yeah, you know, whatever. Me too, yeah. Okay, anyway. And so it's draining. Because in part you're meeting all these people. But it's interesting that the conversation, for me personally, conversations have not been about the sermon itself, but about wanting to get to know me. And who are you? You know, what do we have in common? You know, how do I connect? I've connected with you somehow. Can I get to know you better?
Yeah. Nice. Yeah.
It's interesting that in that first story you shared, she intentionally set that up as a time.
Yeah.
Right? And so I imagine that mentally she had prolonged this is how long I'm on today. Right? Which would be important, I think. I think when it is really wearisome is when you just have this idea of, okay, it's 11:15, I'm done.
Right.
I've done my thing. I preached the sermon. And then someone comes up to you and wants to have a big conversation. And it's harder to get back in there. But if you're thinking, okay, this is an extension now of, my pastoral ministry today. This is part of what I'm geared up for.
And I don't know, in that specific case, not sure, because I went back, this was at a time where I was writing my dissertation. It was an ethnography, so that's one of the churches I used in my ethnography. So I visited repeatedly. I know that she did that for this topic because she knew it was a difficult topic. She didn't do it again in other sermons. So I don't know that it was a standard. I think definitely for her was, I know this is a difficult topic. This is hard to swallow for my people. I want to be able to engage them past my sermon. So, which is a little similar but also different.
Right.
Yeah.
That scenario.
Yeah, I think also that, you were saying, Laura, it's really a part of pastoral ministry.
Yeah.
You see people, and they're not really my people. They're God's people, and I don't feel like I have the right to not be interested in whatever it is that because number one, they came to church, they heard you preach, and you have a relationship with them over a span of time, and the people are just precious. And I think that's, at that point, it's not about me.
That's right.
But, what people need from you as a vessel. And I think that's what, that's what keeps you going. It makes you a pastor, is that kind of love for people. And so it's, it can be very moving. I had a very interesting, situation, and it doesn't mean you're not human. I was late coming in, and so, I didn't have all of the prep time that I would have normally wanted. So I'm trying to get in my side door. This guy's going down the street. I didn't know who it was at first. He pulls over. I see him kind of hobbling across the street, and I'm really like in a hurry, but I can't be, right, because he's gotten out the car. Then I don't know what he wants. It's like 7-something in the morning. I've got to get ready. I'm going in my side door. He sees me and pulls over. It's like, and he says, I knew the family. He says, his mother's passed away. She was on the pastor's committee 30 years ago that brought me there. He said, I just want to say to you, you're the best thing that happened to this church.
Oh, praise God.
And, I was telling my son, and I said, you never know where your encouragement is going to come from.
That's right.
Because in the flesh, I was like, okay, I got to see what this person wants. And literally at 7-something in the morning, that's all he wanted to say. And then he said, my mother told me that years ago. And he said, I didn't understand it then, but he said, young people that have been blessed. And that was really it. And it just taught me again to do all I can to kind of stay out of self, because there was a side of me, this is getting ready to be a bother.
Yeah.
And it ended up being an incredible blessing. Yeah, just to be encouraged. And everybody needs that.
That's right. That's right.
I had a similar experience with a congregant who came into my office at 9:35 for a 10 o'clock service, right? So I'm gearing in, ready to go, prayer, all of that, right? And he comes in and says, "Do you have a minute?" And I said, "Yeah, but only if it's a minute, because I got things to do," right? And he sits down and he says, my wife was diagnosed with cancer this week. Can I make an announcement before the prayer?" That is the worst feeling I think I've ever had as a pastor, right? Of telling this congregant who needed a pastor that they only had a minute because I had important work to do.
You know, what's interesting is those instances where you realize you're not worthy. Of course, that feeling of not worthiness is kind of what makes you eligible, you know, to do the role. And so it's, you know, that's kind of interesting, almost seem like it's a contradiction, but it's, you know, and I didn't feel worthy after, you know, thinking that this guy's getting ready to bother me. And,
Right.
and all he wanted to do was encourage me.
But I do think that's so interesting that there's, like, we're preachers, and preachers are pastors, right? And sometimes I can forget that. I think we can all forget that, right? That people want to hear a good sermon. They also want you to be their pastor.
That's right.
On Sunday morning, or Wednesday morning, or Sunday night, or whenever it is, right?
Yeah. What kind of, if any, do you have a feedback system? Do you have a way to know, like, if your sermon series is hitting, do you have any if the elders supervise you, do they have any kind of system that they use for feedback afterwards where you can get congregational input? Do you know of any churches that do this and do it well in a way that you don't find completely crushing to your spirit
Yeah, right.
as a preacher? At my previous church, there was someone who would take notes during the sermon, and then she, on Monday or Tuesday, would send an email to the church, who would send the email blast, not critiquing the sermon, but we called it living into the word. And so she just would identify one or two key points she had taken away, and then one or two questions for the congregation, which was really lovely because A, I didn't have to do it, right? And B, I got to see every week at least how one person heard the sermon, right? What they took from it. And then I knew what was going out to the congregation also in terms of how are they being asked to
Did you ever have to correct
think about it?
Oh, no, that's not what I said.
No.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah, she was on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, that was really good. So that is something that I have thought about, like I would like to bring that practice back into this church, whether it is one of the pastors, or if it's one of the other pastors, or if there's a really eager beaver congregant. Because I think that's just another way of letting things live longer too, right? Like with your devotionals, to help people take Sunday morning into Monday through Saturday, and think about it and percolate it. And in a similar way, to start sending out the scripture passage and some of those questions ahead of Sunday.
This is, not everybody got access to this particular feedback system. Mine is my wife, who I'm very much in love with, but can be brutally honest. And I love her for it. But to me, that's, for me, even when I was a pastor, she was my main feedback about what was going on, or how the sermon had gone. And it's just in the car, going back, and I would go, "So how did it go?" And she would, you know that joke that you told that, that was not funny. Or, you did well on this and this and that. And, and my children were also very good. My youngest daughter, who at age 10 was like 17, right? Or 20 or something. She's like, Dad, you gotta work on this stuff. Do they pay you for this? So, yeah, now she has 2 kids of her own. Ha 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 ha. And so anyway, but that's how I received feedback. When I was a pastor, it was my spouse, and still is my spouse.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about one of my mother's board again, folks.
They let
Oh,
you.
I'm sure they got an opinion.
It got back to me. She meant it in a loving way. She said, "Now we can tell that Reb, he just kind of ran out of stuff to say, and he just started talking. So, so we know he just ran out." My oldest son, whenever he begins a sentence talking about my sermon with, now I don't mean this in a negative way. I kind of know the critique is coming, right? So, yeah. That, what's been interesting over the journey for me is that, you get feedback from people. They'll tell you what helped them often. Maybe not so much what didn't help, but certainly what helped them is some of what I would consider the worst sermons that I've preached. I've gotten some incredible feedback that always reminded me, not by power,
Amen.
not by might, not by my
Amen.
spirit. And I really challenge younger preachers, and I've got about 7 or 8 with me, and then I've become a senior pastor. I didn't know, until maybe a couple of months ago I was a senior pastor, but it's dawning on me to not be so performance-driven as a preacher. Because you don't know how people are hearing it.
That's right.
Because their hearing is based on where they are.
Yeah.
And so some of what I would consider the worst sermons that I preached, where I didn't get to charge, out of people, I've had somebody inevitably say, hey, and when you said this, and it helped them. And then, of course, in our tradition, again, one of the signs that it was a spirit-filled message and service is when people walk the aisle to either accept Christ or to renew their walk with Christ. And so when people come down the aisle, the Holy Spirit has spoken. And to have that happen on some of the days you think were your worst days, and then when you hit the home run and nobody comes.
Right? Yes.
It just reminds you how vain our vanity is about preaching often, whether we did good or not. And that's part of what gets on my nerves with my son. I don't know if he's listening. But all of this extra effort and this emphasis on the cerebral that I know has to do with him being a novice of sorts compared to me is that, just, say what the Bible says, because whatever you're thinking about is not going to be more profound than that. I mean, once you figure out you got really limited amount of things to say left to your own devices, we probably heard all you had to say your last 3 sermons. If you're going to come up with anything that's going to actually have any power to it, you just need to get the word and find out what the word is saying and say what the word said. And that'll be life-changing.
Amen. Amen. We have a few minutes. If you want to walk forward to the mic and ask a question, we would welcome that.
And I want my son to I want my son to know I didn't mean that in any negative way. There you go.
Go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you all to all the presenters. My question was around kind of special events, so like weddings and funerals, maybe even baptisms. When you have like you're preaching to like a wedding, to the couple, but you're also preaching for everyone there. And how does that change the communal preaching in those particular contexts? If you know, like in a baptism service, this is going to be very important for that family. They're going to remember this probably, but everyone also is there. It's just a regular Sunday for them. And funerals, obviously, it's very pastoral, very around. You probably meet with the family ahead of time and whatnot. So, we'd just love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
For me, and I do it sometimes also during sermons that are not in those special occasions, is that sometimes I said, today I want to talk to the men, or today I want to talk to the women, or, whatever. But I know that we all need to hear these kind of things anyway. So I'm not worried about the outside of that circle. I'm obviously focusing on that I want to communicate to whom I want to communicate. Knowing full well that I know that we all need to hear the word, and we all need to be reminded of some things at certain times. And so I do hone into those people that I want to talk to, and know that everybody else that is listening are going to listen anyway, probably because they want curious to what they said that you're going to say to them, and it will also touch them somehow.
Anybody else got something there?
I've found that funerals are incredible opportunities to preach. Mm-hmm. We used to have in our tradition revival services where we would say, bring the unchurched, and then we would bring in the preacher to preach that week. The funeral is the new revival. I mean, it's the one that I try to really be prepared for, because that's when I'm going to have the most opportunity to preach to the unchurched. Another thing that I've always challenged, and even in preaching classes, when you're asked to do anything in the public square, invocations, you should never wing those. Incredible opportunity to be a prophet. Called to do the invocation at the city council, to be called to do the benediction for the governor's inauguration, or a school commencement speech in the secular world. Incredible opportunities to really be a preacher in the public square, and to hone your ability to preach outside of a church context, which, I would never want to be limited, that I could only preach to the choir, can only preach in church context, can only preach to denominations of people who, may have a different denominational or doctrinal piece. The exciting part to me is to be able to preach in the public square. One of my great moments that I remember that was just so meaningful to me was we had a kid that was a ward of the state and was shot 16 times by a police officer. His name was Laquan McDonald. We actually now have his image in a stained glass window at our church. He was a foster kid who was molested. He was 16 when he was killed. It was a big 16. His grandmother just died. He was just, hated going back to the juvenile center. So he really was giving the police a rough time to round him up that night. It's a long story. I mean, I went to the trial. It was interesting. He was a kid. He's shot and killed. Laquan McDonald. And everybody around Chicago, that was kind of like the central name. It was Chicago Magazine said They normally listed the 100 most influential Chicagoans, and they said, we're going to list the mayor, we're going to list the county board president, we're going to list this person, the corporate titan. They said if we were to really list the name that probably is the most consequential name around which all of the power dynamics of the city surround, it would be Laquan McDonald. And I had preached the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. You know, the rejected, a ward of the state, killed by an officer of the state. And they tried to cover it up. And the mayor was reelected in the cover-up. Because who in the heck would care what happened to this kid? Except God did. And made his name, you know, almost as politically dangerous as saying the name of Jesus in the first century as to what it would attract. And I had remember working for the clerk, and they didn't know what they were doing. They had me on to do the invocation for the city council. And there was one of the most powerful politicians in America standing next to me. And I knew I had to mention Laquan McDonald in the invocation. And trembled, you know. But those are incredible opportunities to preach in the public square when you're asked to do those things. And it could take courage, because, you know, say a nice platitude would have been easy enough, but to have to say, this is a tale of two cities. And zip code determines live options. A child born in a place determines what the outcomes. This is immoral. And then to close the prayer, in the name of the one who was born outside the inn, baptized in Jordan, arrested by the Romans, crucified, raised by the power of God. It was an opportunity to preach the gospel at City Hall.
That's right.
Sorry to be long.
No.
That was
Preachers can talk.
It's good.
This has been tremendously helpful and very affirming. I'm just wondering something that passes on my mind every once in a while, and that is, have you or do you watch videos of your preaching, and why or why not?
they're all giving the side eye to each other.
Yeah. So I'll jump. Yeah, I've seen videos of myself. It is probably the most painful experience that I've gone through. More painful than my kids criticizing my sermons. Yes, I have, to make it short, because I think that personally, I think it's a good opportunity to see what the world is seeing. And is that what I'm trying to communicate? Mm-hmm. Is that what I'm trying to do? Mm-hmm. Is what I'm trying to do actually what I am projecting? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's like I said, a painful exercise, but I think an exercise that is worth the time and the effort and the tears that might come.
Mm-hmm.
I do it occasionally, not a lot.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. It's not every Sunday.
Not like every Monday morning. Let's start my week off this way, right?
Yeah.
But I do find it helpful, primarily in identifying tics that I have in preaching. Mm-hmm. I almost said right, and one of my tics is saying right, and I'll notice that more.
Right.
Right, and so yeah, watching a video back is helpful in discerning those things I think might be there, and then having the proof in front of me. Yeah, that's there.
Yep.
Amen to what both of them said.
Yeah. I watch, this will be our last one. I watch myself at least once a semester once with the sound on and once with the sound off.
Oh, okay.
Because if you've been at our chapel, I preach in the round, and watching myself with the sound off, I realized that I had a tendency to kind of hit this side and less so this side, and allow me to go, oh. And then with the sound on, I can pick up on like, oh man, you're speaking really quickly here. And if anybody in the congregation has English as a second, third, fourth language, that maybe, you got to slow down. So once a semester, it's just a discipline. And because I teach preaching also, I always think like I cannot not do what I tell people to do.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and wisdom. I was wondering, so I am halfway through my first year as senior pastor, and I've gotten a lot of feedback, good and constructive. And I'm wondering, when or does the post-sermon like spiral ever go away? And what I mean by that is, or how do you grow through that? Because I'll have a lot of questions. I thought of this when you said this, but then sometimes it turns into like a barrage of me overthinking everything that I just said. And then why am I doing this job? And what am I doing here? And what is earth? And it is like this spiral. And my husband is also, great about, being honest with me. And then he'll say, I don't want to trigger the post-sermon spiral. And then he'll say something. But this has been happening for a while now. And I'm like, is this something I grow through as a pastor? Or, because I've been preaching now for a couple of years. But now that I'm senior, it feels like I should be growing through that. And does anybody else do that? Yeah.
I would say it's a yes and. So if your husband doesn't want to start the post-preaching spiral, then he shouldn't. When I was first married, I said to my husband, who was learning how to be the husband of a pastor, I said, you can't talk to me about the sermon until at least Tuesday. Because I'm way too tender right after. Like, And even then, the first 12 things you say have to be good.
Yeah.
Because we all know where our sermons are weak. We all know where they could have been better. We're all doing the drive home going, that could have been tighter, So we don't really sometimes we need people to say that. But I also find, there's a Sunday coming every week. So I was like, well, all right, that wasn't great. Guess what? We get to do it again. And I think about it, the image I use with my students is to think about it like making a meal. And some weeks it's like, it's the filet mignon, it's the sauteed this and the fancy pants that, or the vegan option. And some weeks it's hamburger helper, and it's like, guess what? People still getting fed. They're still getting fed. So I think Marshall's great comment about our own vanity can get in our way. And I would think too, like, this is a matter of prayer. To be like, because that is not the voice of Jesus speaking into your life right then, right? So to be able to say like, no, that's not the voice of Jesus, I'm not going to listen. You do it like that. Other comments on the post-sermon spiral?
I don't know when you take your Sabbath, but I switched to taking my Sabbath on Fridays and not Mondays now, which I found to be really helpful with this because again, right, you have Sunday afternoon, which I just fill with sitcoms, right? And then Monday, I'm in the next sermon.
Yep.
And so I don't have another full day to be stewing, and that's been really helpful.
Any other last wise advice, gentlemen?
I love that there's the next Sunday. And I think that at some point, we all have been there. I should have said this. I rarely say that anymore. But I think that at some point, in my spirit, I said, my goal is just to be a preacher. And all the sermons aren't going to be good, and all of them are going to be the same. And you know, I had to preach through a bad cold a month or so ago, and I had like, you know, a couple of very good King Day appointments, and some funerals, and you know, but I'm just gonna be faithful, and I'm gonna deliver the word, and I'm just gonna keep going. So I think that, you know, at some point, as we go, I think a couple of years is a little too soon to expect to be there, but at some point, you're just gonna be a preacher, and you're gonna just preach, and you're gonna keep preaching, and there's always something that needs to be said the next time that you didn't say this time, and you keep going.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. Keep going. That's a good word to end on.
Yes.
Let's thank our guests.